Okay, we're going to be looking today at the healing of the demoniacs, because in Matthew it talks about two of them, and in the other portions of Scripture that talk about the same scenario, it's Mark and Luke speak about one individual. But that doesn't mean that one story is wrong and the other story is right. Again, what Matthew is doing is he is uh, uh, using material that summarizes situations and stories. So there was um, uh, two men that were involved, and what Mark and Luke are doing is they're looking at specifically one individual. Anyway, so we just have to accept what the scriptures say in regard to these things, and how the likes of Matthew is dealing with this. So today we're dealing with the healing of the demoniacs on the other side of the sea. And if I can just get myself a little spotlighter pointer. Oops. Yeah, there we go. So the disciples, they were over on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and if you remember, the Sea of Galilee is sort of roughly the same length and width like Loch Ness. So if you can imagine the being over in Ballyronan, which is sort of over down the road from Macrofeld, so that would be sort of on the western side of things. And the disciples then would have gotten in the boat, came over to the other side, and was over in here somewhere where there was the storm in the Sea of Galilee, where the disciples would have said, "Master, do you not care that we're perishing?" And so they did get to the other side, and so they came over to this region over here, which had a variety of different names depending on where you come from. So it was referred to as Gardara, or the Gergeshenes, or the Gadarenes. But anyway, it's over here. There's a question mark next to this thing about Gergesha, and that basically means they're not entirely sure as to where it is, other than it's on the eastern side of the lake. But this would have been in the region of what was called Decapolis, and Decapolis was a collection of 10 cities, which would have been down in this area, down at the southeast sort of side of the Sea of Galilee. So that's geographically where we're going today. So we'll just X that out there and head around to this next slide. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at not just the Matthew account, because the Matthew account is quite short compared to the other ones. So I think it's important when you're studying Scripture, and you know that there's the other stories as well that are relayed. Read them all, and then you can get the whole picture of what's happening. So we're going to read Matthew 8, 28 to 34. So I'm just going to bring up a couple of paragraphs at a time here. So it says, when he had come to the other side, to the country of the Gergeshenes, as that's pronounced there, there met him two demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, "What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place, and into the sea, and perished in the water. And then those who kept them fled, and when they went away into the city, told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. So that's the account of Matthew, and we're going to read through all the accounts here, and then we'll go back and sort of pluck a few bits and pieces out of these particular passages of Scripture. But just try to um, keep in mind what's going on. Much of the material is the same, but there are certain details that are more emphasized in one passage over another. So we'll look at Mark here. Now, I know this text is small, probably especially for those of you that have phones. So if you just listen, that'll work out okay. It says, so they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes, and when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains. And the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." And then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also, he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. Now, a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us out of the swine, that we may enter them." And at once he gave them permission. And then the unclean spirits ran out and entered the swine, and there was about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid, and those who saw it told them how it happened to them who had been demon possessed and about the swine. And then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he had got into the boat, he who had been demon possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. Right, just look at the one from Luke here, chapter 8, verse 26 to 39. It says, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, which was opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. He wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles, and he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. And Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that they would not command them to go into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain, so they begged him that he would permit them to enter them. And he permitted them. And then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the lake and drowned. And those that fed them saw what had happened, and they fled and told it in the city and in the country. And then they went out to see what had happened, and came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. They also, when they had seen it, it told them by what means he had been demon possessed and was healed. And then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. So there's the three stories. There are the three accounts of these demoniacs, and so you can see that probably Mark and Luke have more detail in terms of the encounter and the conversation that Jesus has with the demons, and actually what had happened with the man once he was healed. So we're going to, oops, sorry, there's one other verse there. I'll read that too. It says, now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with them, but Jesus went away, saying, return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you. And he went away and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. So, sorry about that. I sometimes don't always know exactly how these slides are going to come up. So anyway, so what we're going to do, again, as we've done with the rest of the stories of Matthew 8, and as we go into Matthew 9, because this is the end of Matthew 8 here, but this is the second miracle in this set of miracles, the second set. So the first set was about the leper that had gotten healed, and about the centurion's servant and Peter's mother-in-law. And now we're into the second set, and so this is the second of the second set. So last week we looked at the storm, and that Jesus has authority not only over the physical elements, but he has authority over spiritual forces and spiritual powers and principalities. And so as he gets to the other side, we're now talking about the spirit world, the demonic world. And then there's going to be another miracle here about the man that is paralyzed being brought to Jesus, and how Jesus initially forgave his sin. But anyway, we'll get everything pulled together eventually. So let's we'll look at the characters first, and then we'll look at how Jesus exercises authority, and then look at the men in terms of what happens to them in terms of possession, but also look at the demons themselves and what they promote through these men. And then we're going to look at how Jesus deals with this whole thing. So that those four areas: the characters, the authority, the approach of the people, and the pastoral response of Jesus. So the characters here, obviously, we're dealing with Jesus again as the primary character. He is in the middle of all of our stories, which is good. We're looking at the characters of the disciples as well. Now, there's not really any conversation that we get much out of the disciples. I think they're probably still having their tail between their legs, in a sense, from the storm exercise over the Sea of Galilee, because they essentially got told off by Jesus. How is it that you have no faith? And so I think the disciples are sort of putting the sock in their mouth and going, right, we're going to be good now, and we're going to observe what Jesus does, because we need Jesus in the midst of things here, and Jesus will handle this perfectly. Because sometimes when we come across the sea of our lives and the transition of life, we think that Jesus is not doing things right. But Jesus never does anything wrong. So we did look at that last week. And then we're considering the demon-possessed men, and obviously I have men there in plural because there's two that are mentioned in Matthew, and then there's a single individual that's mentioned in Mark and Luke. And then there's the pig owners. These are the men that are the farmers. Pigs were an unclean animal to the Jews. So Jews didn't farm pigs. They didn't eat pigs because they were regarded as an unclean animal. They did have a cloven hoof, but they did not chew the cud. One of the things about a clean animal, according to Jewish law that God had laid down with Moses, a clean animal was that which had a cloven hoof and chewed the cud. If the domestic animal did not do one of these things or both of these things, then it was regarded as unclean. So pig did not chew the cud, but it did have a cloven hoof. Another animal that that would have been eaten perhaps in those days, but again not by Jews, would have been maybe a rabbit. But a rabbit does not have a cloven hoof, but it does chew the cud in sort of a strange sort of way. But anyway, so it would have been regarded as an unclean animal. So and then fish, in terms of clean fish, would have been any fish that had scales. But if a fish did not have scales, things like catfish, sharks, skates, and that kind of stuff, they would have been regarded as unclean animals because a lot of those kinds of animals would have been bottom feeders and fed on dead matter, and so they would have been regarded as unclean, and any shellfish would have been regarded as unclean. So Orthodox Jews today still are very kosher about what they eat. So this idea of pigs in the Bible would have been quite a reprehensible thing for Jews, and so we don't know whether these pig owners or pig farmers were Gentiles. Probably more likely they were, but if they were Jews, they were definitely involved in a very unclean exercise. So, but I think what it demonstrates is that this whole unclean thing and the association that there is with demons. And then we have the locals. These are the people that are in the city or in the country that the pig owners then went to, and then they came and saw what Jesus was doing, and then they told Jesus to leave. So we have a variety of characters, a variety of people that are involved with this whole story. So we have individuals, and then we have groups of people, and we'll be looking at all these groups in one shape or another. In terms of the authority of Jesus that he is exercising in this particular story, I think primarily is that he is exercising authority over the spirit world, because these are men that are possessed of devils, possessed of demons, and we're going to look at the what that control looks like a little in a slide or two. But in terms of the authority that Jesus has over this thing, he demonstrates complete and absolute authority over the spirit world. And these demons obviously know who Jesus is. So there's that, but there's also the authority that Jesus has in terms of bringing peace, because Jesus is one that does desire to bring peace, and he can do that. Now, oftentimes we are at war within ourselves, we are at war with other people, or at odds, or whatever, and because of those things, we are very unsettled. And so when the demon-possessed man is healed and has been brought to be sitting, that is a demonstration of Jesus bringing peace to him. And now the man couldn't bring peace to himself, may have tried, but because he's demon-possessed, he's not capable of doing that. So the authority of Jesus needs to come in and do something about that. And what he does is he brings peace. And then he has authority over shame and over reproach. And reproach are things that we regret, things that we're ashamed of, things that we wish we hadn't done, and that kind of thing. And that's a lot of internal stuff that that rummages around within ourselves. And but Jesus has authority over those things. That reminds me a bit of that verse that we had looked at in Psalm 119 a number of weeks ago, where it said, and turn away my reproach, which I dread, for your judgments are good. Because the psalmist realized that he could not turn himself away from shame and from reproach, so he needed God to come and turn his attention away from those things. And so Jesus then does that with this particular man and has authority over his shame, because he was naked and running around like a mad thing. And so now he is clothed in that regard. So, and then the next thing is he has authority over twisted thinking, because the man eventually was in his right mind. And so that means if he was in his right mind, that meant that he wasn't always in his right mind. And obviously we know that from the story, that he was running around demented, and fierce and antagonistic, and all kinds of things like this. Pandered to lies and so on. So his thinking was twisted. It was twisted in regard to social things. It was twisted in regard to mental things. It was twisted in regard to physical things, and especially spiritual things. So Christ had authority over that and brought him into his right mind. So and thus what that brings is safe thinking. So I think it's one thing that we need in our day and age, and the world and the devil and the flesh is constantly bombarding us, trying to get us to think and pander in a certain way that then makes us feel unsafe, and so then we go and try to imbibe in some sort of thinking that ultimately will bring bondage to us as opposed to freedom. So this is a bit about the authority of Jesus over the spirit world, and in regard to these things about peace and shame and reproach and twisted thinking and so on. So we'll revisit these things a little bit a little later on. Now, let's look at the state of the men, the guys that were demon possessed, and then we'll look at the state of the demons themselves. Now, the two sort of are pretty twisted up in terms of they're amalgamated, they're possessed men, but I think it's important to draw a bit of a distinction between the men and the demons that are in them and what they're trying to promote. So let's look at the men first of all, and these men are controlled by Satan. Satan's desire is to control man and to get into them, whether that be physically or spiritually or mentally, trying to control them, to get them to pander to lies, do harm to themselves, all that kind of stuff. And what that ends up resulting in is feeling incredibly insecure, because security is a psychological thing that we seek to fulfill. We want to feel safe, and what we end up doing is, if we do not feel safe, we then try to find something that will make us feel safe. And if we can't find something that really works terribly well, then we'll go off the deep end and do self-destructive things. That could be a drink thing. It could be self-harm. It could be drugs. It could be, involvement in wrong relationships. It could be a whole host of stuff. So, and also what happens with these particular men, because the control is by Satan, is that they feel then very insignificant, and they feel that they don't matter to anybody. They don't matter to God. They don't matter to society. Society has shunned them anyway, so therefore they might as well just go out into the wilderness and flop about, and so if they died or if they moved on in some way, nobody would honestly care, And I remember dealing with an individual one time out in the community, and he was a fellow that had spent time in prison here in Northern Ireland, but he was English, and that has its own kind of complications in particular circles that one might revolve around in. And so he served his time, was released, and exhibited a drink problem, and was then put into a residential context within a particular part of Northern Ireland. And but he had no family in Northern Ireland. I think he had some sort of a daughter or son or something like that, but didn't have a partner or a wife or any of these kinds of things in Northern Ireland. So he was very much on his own. So while he was in this residential unit, he sort of took a bit of a head staggers and went walkies, as we would say, and headed on down to a pub that was run by Republican paramilitaries, and having an English accent and going into that kind of an environment is not a good thing to do. So he then got bundled into the back of a taxi, was taken out into the country, stripped, and left for dead. And the next time I saw him was in the hospital, where the police had found him. And really, if the guy had been killed or anything like that, and then dumped in a ditch and a bunch of concrete thrown over it, or something like that, nobody would have known. Nobody would have cared. And but that's the kind of environment and kind of place that Satan wants to get us. He wants to get us into an insecure place, an insignificant place, where we feel about ourselves, well, sure, I don't matter. So, and then the third thing here is to feel then rather unacceptable. So, and these are the three areas that a lot of counselors and psychologists and different people would suggest that we all look for to fulfill. We want to feel safe and secure. We want to feel that we matter in terms of being significant to somebody or something. And we want to feel acceptable. And I've told this story before about acceptance in regard to me when I was growing up, because I felt very much somewhat unaccepted because I wasn't very sporty. I couldn't hardly kick a ball and that kind of thing. So anytime that there was a dividing up of teams, in terms of there was jock number one, who was the captain of team A, and then there was jock number two, who was captain of team B, and they would say, I want Bob, and I want Scott, and I want this and that and the other thing. And so I was always the last one to get picked, and generally they would fight over who wouldn't get me, so because like, no, sure, you can have Woody, he's we don't want him on our team, so it made me feel great, and so I felt somewhat unaccepted in that regard, and it's just because of I couldn't I couldn't kick the ball or pass the ball or play basketball or do any of those things, so and then once you start taking that on board and you start believing that for yourself, then that's what becomes part and parcel to you. So these men, and the state of them was that they were controlled by Satan. They were insecure, insignificant, unacceptable, and they believed lies. So instead of buying into the truth, and as Jesus says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, they were very much in bondage because they were believing lies about God, about themselves, about society, a variety of things. So, and some of us would understand these things quite acutely, and then there may be some of us that may understand this, from an intellectual perspective. But I think by and large, we get this. We get this this state of being. So now the demons, however, because of what is stated, if you see there in Matthew, if you have your Bible open to the Matthew passage, it says, when they come to the other side, to the country of the Gergesenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs. So there's an association that demons have with death and with destruction, because we know later on that when the demons go into the pigs, that the pigs then run violently down the steep bank into the sea and are drowned. And so that there's always this association with death and destruction and taking people to a lost eternity, as it were. So that's what demons are about. Satan in the old days, wanted to be like God. He wanted to, bring his throne higher than God's, and so on. And so there was the arrogance and the pride of the enemy, of Lucifer, and then he was cast down because of that, because he was trying to usurp the authority of God. And so he took many angels with him that then became demons. So there's always this association with death and destruction and arrogance in that sense. So and then there's it says there that as these men were coming out of the tombs, that they were exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And so the demons are fierce, and they're antagonistic. They're in your face. They're really, you don't want to be around them, and that's what's put into these men, and people tried to chain them up. People tried to put a guard on them. People tried to do all sorts of things, but they kept on breaking the chains and breaking the bonds and running around and nude and off their nut. So there's no peace here. There's nothing that would lend itself to joy or to any of those things of the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. None of that is being exhibited at all within this demon possession. And it promotes self-harm. Because it says in the Gospel of Mark, in regard to these people, it says in verse 5 of chapter 5, it says, and always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. And self-harm is a very, very complicated thing, because sometimes we look at somebody and we would say, if we know that have heard that somebody is cutting themselves, we think that that's an attempt at suicide, and it isn't necessarily. What happens here is that there's so much mental pain that is going on in oneself, that what they do is then they would create a physical pain in order to basically create a distraction so that the physical pain then sort of outweighs the mental pain that's going on. So it's a diversion tactic in that sense. And I've known people that have, cut their arms to shreds and that kind of thing, or they do other kind of self-harm activities. And it is for this purpose of deflecting from mental and emotional pain. It's not necessarily to kill themselves. So, so it's a very, very complicated, very sinister sort of thing. And I think we need to, for those who are self-harming, we need to seek to understand their space and where they are in it and why they're doing it. And because of the nature of it, it itself can then become quite addictive, and take you down a road where you start doing it a lot because there's an adrenaline rush that comes with it, and you feel that it answers certain questions. So you start going down that road, just like drink, drugs, pornography or gambling or any of those kinds of things. It all sort of sits in that same sort of space. So, and that's what these demons are doing, is they're promoting self-harm in these men. And they're untamable by man, because it says in verse 4 of chapter 5 of Mark, it says, or in verse 3, it says that who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had been often bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart, shackles broken pieces, neither could anyone tame him. So, and demons cannot be tamed by man. It's and this is again a demonstration of the authority of God, and that's why God has to be very much in the middle of these things, and driving these demons out, because we can't drive out demons ourselves, because these are spiritual entities who are bent on our destruction, and they cannot be tamed by conventional methods by man. But one thing they did understand is that they understood Jesus' absolute authority, because when they come out of these, verse 6 there of chapter 5 of Mark, it says, when they saw Jesus from afar, they ran and worshipped him, and they cried out with a loud voice, what do we have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, that you do not torment me. And so they understood who Jesus was, and they understood, probably their theology in a lot of ways was probably, a lot better than some, liberal churches about us today. They understood who Jesus Christ was, and they understood his authority. There's liberal churches today that would not even accept the authority of Jesus. They wouldn't even, and then cults would say that Jesus wasn't even God. So, demons really have no interest in cults and that kind of thing in that sense, because, well, sure, they're going to hell anyway, so why really sort of bother with them? And those men and women are just off the deep end. So, but where demons operate is where there are things where God is nearby, and they really want to try to wrestle people away from God. But they certainly understand the authority of Jesus, because it says in the book of James that the demons believe, but they tremble, because they know exactly where they're going to go. Demons cannot be redeemed. The angelic world, Christ did not die for them. So when they sin, when they do something wrong, that's them cooked. So, and then that's why they're talking about, but please don't, send us out of the country or send us into the abyss and that kind of thing at this particular stage. They don't like being disembodied, and again, that's why the demons, the way they operate is in possession. They can't just sort of float around. They don't like just floating about. They feel that they need to be in somebody or some animal, and so they don't like being disembodied. So, and that's why they said, asked Jesus, that they might go into the swine. And so, but again, that's, talking about, we need to go into an unclean thing because that's where we live, is in these wretched things. And the other thing about demons is they're not just sort of nondescript entities. They have identity. They have a name because Jesus asks them, engages with them, and says, what is your name? Now, again, Jesus is not asking a question here because he doesn't know. He is asking a question here in order to draw out information really for our benefit, and that is to understand that there is not just one demon that's involved, but a whole host of them. And we know that there's at least 2,000 entities, because Mark would say that there was, in verse 13 there were about 2,000 in terms of swine. So if each animal is, has a demon in them, so we're talking, at least 2,000. Now, if they're saying that their name is Legion, and that is married up with what a Roman legion was. A Roman legion would have been 6,000 men. Now, so if we use the number of 6,000, then in each pig there was three demons. So anyway, but what it demonstrates is that there was a lot of them kicking about. But they had an identity. They had a name, and so I find that interesting. Is that they're not just nondescript entities. They're not just ethereal forces floating about or something like this. They are individual things that have identity, have bad purpose assigned to them, and they're real. So that is one thing that the Bible is not short on in terms of helping us to see that the demonic world is alive and well out there. So anyway, we see here then the state of these men and the state of the demons. So let's look at then Jesus' pastoral approach and to these things and to this man. So now, the first point I have here is that he came to deal with specific individuals that were a long way off. Because I find it interesting that Jesus deals with this storm and deals with traveling 7 miles across the water to the other side of the lake, which on a good day probably wasn't a big deal, but in a bad storm it is a big deal. And comes to deal with essentially 2 men, and these men that are full of these demons, and because after this is dealt with, the people in the area didn't want Jesus to be hanging about, and so Jesus then got in the boat and went back to the other side, and so they came to deal with these specific individuals, and that really shows me the length and breadth to which Jesus will go in terms of pastoral approach and pastoral care for people. He'll go the distance. He'll come a long way off. One of my colleagues, I don't think well, I'll just leave it as one of my colleagues here, just to tell the story in sort of a general sense. But one of my colleagues within Stars went to go and see a man, and actually drove 5 hours on spec to go and see this guy, and didn't make arrangements to meet him or anything like that. He just drove to his house, and the man answered the door and said to him, why did you come to me today? And my colleague said to him, God has told me to tell you that he still loves you. and he was a backslidden Christian, and he was the man had been some sort of a leader in a church, but had gotten off the, the beaten track and off of God's path, and probably felt that there was no way back. And so my colleague went 5 hours to tell that man this, and the man was restored to the Lord, and then he drove 5 hours back. And that was the visit of that very, very long day. And but I remember hearing that story and thinking, here's a man who's prepared to go 5 hours, one direction to go and see a guy and bring him a message of hope, and the guy is restored, and how much more the Lord Jesus Christ has come to us all the way from heaven, from a spiritual ideal environment to a very sinful, sin-sick place. But his desire is for us. His desire is to restore us as sick, sin-sick individuals, and to bring us into a right relationship with God, because he loves us. Jesus loved this man. This demon-possessed man would be a hard guy to love, because he was nuts. He was just off his nut, and he wouldn't be the kind of guy that probably a lot of us would want to go and be friends with in any way, shape, or form. And but Jesus was, Jesus was prepared to be this guy's friend, and so he goes a long, long way in order to deal with specific individuals. Second point here is Jesus had no fear in dealing, I should say, with the men and the associated demons. So he had no fear in dealing with that. So Jesus didn't cower. Jesus didn't, go across the sea. In fact, when Jesus was, asleep on the boat, he was very content in a lot of ways. It's like, well, I'm going to deal with this thing, and and praise God that God is not fearful of man nor the demonic, demonically associated things. So, God always knows how to deal with these things, and because it says. In Mark 5, it says when they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes, and when he had come out of the boat, Jesus didn't sit around in the boat and kind of put his head in his hands and go, gosh, I really don't want to be dealing with this, but he gets out of the boat and confronts this thing, because immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. And there, when it says in Luke chapter 8, verse 27, it says when he had stepped out on land, so Jesus was prepared to get out. He got out of the boat, and he dealt with this thing and dealt with it head on. And he addressed the issues of the men. And as we were thinking earlier about the authority that Jesus was demonstrating here, what he did is he brought security, he brought significance, and he brought acceptance. So the very things that the men were embroiled in, that made them insecure and insignificant and unacceptable, Jesus addressed those particular things. And he also brought contentment, he brought peace, he brought stability, and he brought safety in the mind. I think a lot of people that I deal with that feel very, very unsafe in their thinking, and so they try to quell that with a variety of things. Again, my work, whether it be through drink or drugs, or bad relationships, or on prescribed medication, or whatever the case is. But Jesus can break through that and bring a real sense of contentment, real sense of peace, stability and safety in the mind. And then the last thing that he does with the men, if you Now, this is not mentioned in terms of uh, in the Gospel of Matthew, but in the other accounts, uh, it says in verse 18 of Mark, it says when he got into the boat, he who had been demon possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had compassion on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. And always find this interesting in terms of the language, because Jesus says, go home to your friends. So he gives them direction and he gives them purpose and says, tell them what great things the Lord's done for you and how he's had compassion on you. And now, what I find interesting here is that Jesus is saying, what great things the Lord has done for you. And and then what the man does is he proclaims in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him. So the man obviously is equating the Lord and Jesus together. And it's the same in the Gospel of Luke, where it says there in verse 38 of chapter 8, says, "Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him." And that's understandable. I understand, that the man wants to be with Jesus now, but Jesus has greater purposes for him. But it says that Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your own house and tell what great things God's done for you." And he went away and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. So there's an equality then between who God is and who Jesus is. Now, the reason I have up on the screen there Mark chapter 7 is I just want to read that particular section to you, because this is where Decapolis is mentioned again, but in another story, which is a couple of chapters away from Mark 5. So it says in verse 31, just reading it to you, I don't have it on the screen, but it says in Mark chapter 7, again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. And then they brought him one who was deaf and an impediment in his speech. And they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him to the side from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears and spat and touched his tongue. And they looked. And then he, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to them, "Ephphatha, that is, be opened." And immediately his ears were opened and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. And then he commanded that no one should tell him, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it, and they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well, and he makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." But this particular deaf-mute man was in Decapolis, and so the idea is that this could have happened because the demoniac of Gardara went back to his house and told the people in the town all of what the Lord had done for him. And so they then, when they heard Jesus was coming, then they were prepared to bring people to him. So the guy had a good witness in that region, because they saw what the Lord could do. So that's a bit about the pastoral approach of Jesus. But we have some of these other characters of the farmers and the locals here, and we just want to look at them for a minute or two, and then we'll finish. And so basically, the farmers fled the scene and told the locals, because it says there in Luke chapter 8, verse 34, "And then those who fed them saw what had happened. They fled and told it in the city and in the country. And I'm sure that they were not terribly amused at what happened to their livelihood, and so then they started telling the folk what had happened. So and then the locals then go out to see what's taken place. Now I think they're in some ways probably happy to see the man healed, but because it says there that in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 35, says they went out to see what had happened and came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. But the problem is as they went out to see, it says, well, probably the farmers were upset about the loss of pigs. This was their livelihood. Now, if these were Jews farming these pigs, they knew that they were not doing the right thing anyway. Sometimes God does this. God, brings about circumstances where he sort of pulls the rug out, from certain circumstances to get us to start doing the right thing. But then fear came because it says they were afraid. And they also who had seen it were told by what means the demon-possessed man was healed. And they sort of didn't know what to do with this, because it upset their apple cart a bit. And as a result, they would have asked Jesus to leave. And and it is a good thing, really, that Jesus asked the guy to stay, because otherwise there would have been really no witness left. But I want to read a little portion out of John Maxwell's notes here in regard to this particular story out of Luke. And he writes this bit entitled Commitment, Solve Our Problems, but Save Our Pigs. And it says, Jesus once met a man controlled by a legion of demons. The poor man had lost control and had to be chained and kept under guard. When Jesus cast the offending demons into some nearby pigs, the man instantly grew calm and whole. Ironically, when the area's residents took one look at the man, they asked Jesus to depart. No doubt they felt pleased to see this man healed, but not at the expense of their livestock. They feared the demon-possessed man, but they feared even more Jesus, who took complete control over the situation. It's important to remember in any conflict, Jesus doesn't want to take sides, he wants to take over. Often we resemble the Gadarenes, those who wanted Jesus to solve their problems but save their pigs. We don't want to upset things or get radical, we say. We want change as long as it doesn't change us. But this is not Jesus' way. And there's a list of lessons in regard to leadership here. He says, note several lessons this passage teaches us about leadership. One, leadership means discomfort. If you're going to be an effective leader, you must live outside of your comfort zone. Two, leadership means dissatisfaction. God uses dissatisfaction as a tool to move us to greater things and higher ground. And three, leadership means disruption. The status quo is never the goal of a leader. Disruption is our constant companion. So there's a lot of lessons that we can learn out of this particular story. But I found that what John Maxwell says here, we tend to say sometimes we don't want to upset things or get radical. We want change as long as it doesn't change us. And but that's what the Lord Jesus Christ wants to do, is he wants to get into our lives and radically change us, because nothing less will do. So So that's the story about the other side of the sea. And so as we head into things next time, for Friday, we'll be looking at the man that was brought in by his friends, and Jesus says to him, "Son, your sons are forgiven you." But in order that the people might know that Jesus has authority on the earth to forgive sins, he then heals the man of his physical problem. So we'll be looking at that next time. So just to give you a bit of heads up too, next Tuesday, we're not going to have Bible study because I have a staff meeting at that particular time. So we'll not be meeting on today week Tuesday, but we will be meeting Friday, and then the following Friday. So